All right, we're back again to talk a little bit more about investing. In our last episode, we went a lot into why we need to invest and why that's important for building a healthy, financial life and being able to navigate successfully to whatever financial future it is that you're looking for. And today, we're going to talk about everyone's favorite question: how do I time my investments? How do I time it to make it work the best, right? Or how do I time it to get the return that I'm seeking? And we're going to give the disclaimer right out of the gate, even though you heard it in the intro. This is not investment advice, and we're not specifically saying that any of the strategies or portfolio mixes that we're talking about today are what's right for you. But we would encourage you to either engage with your current financial professional, or if you have questions, I'm sure Elliott and I would be, more than happy to answer those as well as we can without knowing your entire situation. So feel free to reach out. But yeah, Elliott, let's talk about timing. Because we always get those questions like, should I invest now? Should I? There's an election coming up, and I think we should talk about that in a whole separate episode. Um, but yeah, when you get those questions from clients, like, where do you start with that? Because that's a really, really big and kind of a scary question.
Yeah. And first, I love this topic because it allows us to geek out or nerd out on charts today. And I won't say there's a definitive right answer for everybody, but at least statistically or based on research, there are right answers along these lines. It's just whether it fits again with the idea of emotional or economic decisions, whether the emotional decision fits with the right or the research decision, which they can be different.
Yeah, yeah, and if you're not a chart fan, like, hang in with us because we're gonna keep it as simple as we can. We'll explain the charts well. We're not going to throw like an Excel spreadsheet at you. And yeah, I think, like Elliot was saying in the last episode, and just to catch you guys up for maybe who are just joining us for the first time, it's really just understanding this relationship between risk and return. And I think time plays a really big factor in how we look at that. So yeah, back to you,
Yeah.
Elliot.
So to your question, how do I talk about this with folks? It's really understanding when are the funds going to be spent or when are they going to be used. That's the most important thing when we start talking about timing markets, because if I don't know when they're going to be spent or when they're going to be used, how do we know what investment they should be in? And
Hmm.
the reason I say that is we don't want to take a lot of risk for something that's going to be used, I don't know, let's say tomorrow as an extreme example. You could say a year from now or 2 years from now as a less extreme example. Whereas maybe something that I'm going to plan on spending in 30 years from now, I'm comfortable taking some more risk because there's more time that I can ride out the ups and downs of the market. So that's how I frame it and where we start our initial conversations of when will the funds be used or when do we anticipate them? No one knows exactly. I'm going to spend $83.47 on, the 366 day from now. That's not what we're talking about. But what are our best ideas of it?
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And an analogy I use with my clients is the shorter it is to your desired use of that money, and the more risk you take, that the closer and closer you are to walking to a blackjack or craps table, right? Um, and I love that too, Elliot. It really comes down to like, when do we expect to? And I also would, just for those listening, is it required spending, or is it a choice to spend, right? And so I just had this conversation with a client this week, and she had been thinking about buying a house, and that is just something that she's not too interested in anymore for right now. And she's like, I think I could see myself waiting like 5 to 10 years. And when that was part of the conversation, right? Like, she needs housing, but she no longer wants to buy a home. Now it's not quote unquote required spending, and it's more, well, if I want to buy a house and can before then, I'm okay with that. But if not, I can wait too. And so I think, is it required spending or not? And maybe a better discretionary example would be like, if you're investing to buy a second home or a vacation home, and that's not like an absolute requirement, or if you're investing to go take a vacation someday, that's a very, very different conversation than like, hey, I have all this cash and I want to double it so I can buy a house next year, right?
Yeah. And I would add when you have more flexibility, it's nice in some respects, but I think it also makes the conversation harder or more challenging to decide what to do in terms of investing, right? With the vacation home, the time frame now maybe just became somewhere between 2 and 10 years. Well, those are pretty different time frames now.
Yeah.
So I just want to add that if you're in that position, it might help things, but it might also make the decision more challenging.
Yeah. And just because you have time doesn't mean you want to go all in on the stock market too. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. And so Elliot, when we think about right sizing or, timing our investments or investing for a specific period of time, like how should we go about thinking about that?
Yeah, and I would say everybody thinks about this slightly differently. And Matt, you probably have a different opinion than me, but I try to dissect things into a short-term bucket, and that could be anywhere from a few months, we could make it even shorter, up to maybe a year or two for some folks. Your medium term, maybe 2 to 5 years or so, and then somewhere between 5 and 10 years plus is sort of the longer term bucket, is how I would think about this. It's not perfect. I could argue it could be different time frames. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that a lot. And, for some of my clients, while it adds a little bit of complexity, they actually like to have separate accounts for each of those buckets. Like, even if they're not, retirement is definitely 10 years plus for most of my clients. So that is just naturally like its own account. Whereas something like, checking and savings, that's going to be for 1 to 2 years from now, in most cases. A brokerage account could be, invested in just about anything. That could really be any timeline, right?
Yeah,
But some of them like to have a couple of different brokerage accounts just so they know, like, oh, that's my growth, or that's my 10-year bucket, and this is my 5-year bucket, and those can be invested very differently. So I very much align with how you're thinking there. Yeah.
great. Should we talk
Yeah.
a little bit more about maybe how we position investments? I know you have some cool charts to show.
Yeah, so I want to start before we get like into the actual portfolio, like composition piece here. Why is my screen? We'll just do this, and then sorry for the inception, folks, for a second. Yeah, so for those of you who are watching, and for those of you who are listening, I'll do my best to explain this. But like Elliot and I were just saying, having a defined timeline for some of your decisions or uses of your dollars in those investment accounts are going to help you a ton in terms of where or how you invest that money. So this is just showing, the broader stock market, and some of the bigger events that have happened throughout the last 50 years. And so
And
for
Matt,
those of you,
real quick, before you jump
yeah,
into it, what is
yeah.
this chart? What's the title of this chart?
Markets have rewarded discipline. And so what that says is, stay disciplined with your investments and don't make emotional decisions, or, what is the best thing to do today decisions. Make decisions for the next 10, 20, 30 years. Is that a fair statement, Elliot?
Yeah, I
Would,
think it's
would you
just
agree with
important to
that?
go through the chart title before we dive into that, because I think that's an important point before we get started seeing all the things that are on this.
Yeah, and what for those of you listening, I'll just explain it. But essentially, what this chart is showing is the growth of $1 from 1970 to when this chart ends in 2020 would be from $1 to $80, or I mean, what is that in a percentage, Elliot? I always get, is that like 8,000%, right?
Just keep going.
Yeah, yeah. Um, but anyway, so what this is showing is in short periods of time, there can be very rapid increases, but also rapid decreases. And just for those of you listening, there's like the dot-com bubble in 2000. Most of us can remember 2007, 2008, when the housing crisis happened. And so in a very short period of time, just for that specific crisis, the housing crisis, the this S&P 500 or the 500 biggest companies went down in value 46%. So when Elliott was talking about having these different buckets of money, right? If you were planning on buying a home in 2007, 2008, and I know like hindsight would say, well, that would have been dumb. But if you would have invested that money into the stock market and you needed to buy a house in 2009, you would have had about half of what you originally had to go buy that house. And so that's where, when we see these market events happen, they can go down very quickly, but we also usually see some sort of recovery within a 5 or 6 year period of time. And so that's where I think Elliott's really getting that 5 year bucket. And that's where I would agree with him on that, where if you're planning on buying anything with inside of 5 years, your best bet is probably not to be all in on the stock market. Would you agree with that, Elliott?
I would agree with that. And I think it's worth throwing out some common life examples, maybe. I mean, you put a house out there, but I think paying for a child or a grandchild's education, any sort of major retirement things. So if you're planning a big trip for your family and you're paying for all that, and that's maybe 3 years away, what else would you throw in that bucket?
Yeah, I mean, things like replacing a car. Did you say that? Sorry.
No, no.
No.
Yeah, I haven't said
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Just anything that you could see yourself needing in the next 1 to 5 years typically isn't something that you should be investing towards, at least not in a overly aggressive way.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah. And, I think, just to kind of give some philosophy on this too, I think just the more rapid information moves in our society these days, like these things happen more frequently and faster, just because information, I mean, COVID was a really good example of this. Like, we went from all-time highs and that was the news to 2 weeks later being shut down. This can happen really quickly and you're not going to necessarily have time to pull back the reins on hedging your losses at that point, just with how quickly this all can happen. What are your thoughts on that, Elliott?
I agree. I think the only thing I would add about this chart is when we zoom out, it's very easy to say, hey, okay, it was down and it recovered 5 years later. Obviously, hindsight 2020, we can look at that and go, okay, great. It's much different to actually be in the moment and see your portfolio. Let's say you are 100% in this particular investment, see it down almost 50%, right? Your money's cut in half in the span of a year, let's call it. So I just want to draw that out, that it's easy to look at that and say, okay, I can tolerate that. That's an okay thing. But to actually live it is a different thing.
Yeah, it's the classic, buy low, sell high, right? But in practice, emotionally, it's very much the opposite. Like everything's going well, I should buy like at the top, and oh my gosh, like the world's crumbling beneath me, I should sell and go to cash. Like,
yeah. Will we have a banking system tomorrow? Okay. Who's investing now at that point?
Yep, exactly. And who's not panicking and selling and trying to, run the bank, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's a really good point. And Elliott, I know you have a chart too to just show like how we can hedge or maybe better position ourselves for different time periods and explain like how these things fluctuate over time depending on how you're invested.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite charts. And I do truly get excited about this chart because I think it's one of the best illustrations of aligning time frame for using funds and how you're going to invest them. So I'll do my best to explain this. But down here on one axis, we have 1 year, 5 year, 10-year, and 20-year rolling periods. And the academic part of me likes this because 5-year periods, we can create a lot of those, meaning January out 5 years, February out 5 years, March out 5 years, and continue that. Same for 10 and 20. So we're looking at a lot of data. We're not just looking at a single calendar year and looking at that. But essentially in green here, we have stocks and the range of returns on the other axis. So in a 1 year period, stocks as measured here in this chart was anywhere between negative 39% and positive 47%. So a huge variability in returns. Like we had talked about earlier, if in a year from now I need my money, I probably don't want it to be in stocks because I don't want to wake up a year from now and have the portfolio be down almost 40%. Obviously, if it's up, great, we feel good about that. But if it's not, that's the other side of the coin. And that's where that flexibility comes in, that, if you have a lot of flexibility, maybe stocks would be okay. I'd argue probably not. But because it's probably not going to feel good, but that is an option. And then bonds in blue here, there's less variability. So we have negative 8% on the downside up to 43%, and then a mix of half stocks and half bonds. And that's negative 15 to 33%. But I think what's more interesting as you go out 5, 10, and 20 years, you start to converge on a narrower range. And what I mean by that is if we got to 10 years, stocks have returned somewhere between negative 1% and 19%, which, if you get negative 1% for 10 years in a row, yeah, it's not going to feel good, right? The odds of hitting that exact time period pretty low, but if it does happen to you, that was a possible outcome in the past that someone likely experienced. But what's interesting is you hit that 20-year mark, you get between 6 and 12%, or sorry, 6 and 17% on stocks. And that 6% includes those time periods where stocks went down negative 39% or where they were negative 1% for 10 years. So that's why we talk a lot about time, that if you have the time frame, nothing's guaranteed to go up, right? Past performance is not a guarantee of future results, but historically, stocks have rewarded you for sticking with it, just like Matt's chart there, patience and being disciplined for that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I always like to, when I'm talking about this with clients, I always like to ask them a question of what was like a really hard thing that you faced earlier in life. And it's always so funny, like how you can look back, 10, 15 years ago and be like, that was really hard, but it's not the same like raw emotional feeling of like a crisis that you're currently going through. And when you look at that chart or just hear what Elliott was saying, like, yes, you're not going to have these extreme highs and lows of the 1 year. So like you may get less than an awesome year over time, but it's also a lot less scary to look at the downside when you look at those 15, 20-year periods. And it'll just be one of those things where you're not going to look back and say like, oh, like, do you remember 2011 when I got 40% on my stock holdings? It's like, oh, like I've gotten, 15% over the past 20 years. Like I feel pretty good about that.
Yeah, I think a good example, and this takes me back to something someone once told me, is you're telling me if I don't get off the roller coaster, I'll just be okay. And that was more or less the sentiment. And with your line of thinking there, what you're talking about is maybe we don't want I don't know, the most insane roller coaster ride, right? We don't want the extreme ups and downs. Maybe we want just something that sort of hums along. It doesn't go up super high, it doesn't go down super low. Or maybe we don't want to be on the roller coaster at all. There are those situations too where that's appropriate for some folks. So I'd think about the roller coaster you want to be on, maybe.
Yeah. Or, just spread your money out over different roller coasters so that it's not all going down the highest hill at the same time. Right.
Yeah.
And that's where, just to paint a little bit more of I guess, a granular look into what Elliott was showing is, last episode, and if you haven't listened to that one yet, I would really encourage you to go back and listen to it, because a lot of this is the what to the why, or why do we invest in the first place. And a key thing that we talked about in the last episode was, our main goal is to beat inflation, but also arrive at the destination that we've been talking about today, whether it's 5, 10, 15 years from now, with the most likely probability that we're going to have enough money at that period in time. And so, Elliot, can you see this chart okay? Do I need to make it a little bigger?
I think it looks good.
Okay. And so when we look at this, right, on the far left here, we have an almost all stock portfolio that's returning close to 12% per year. And it's only actually beating inflation, even though it's much higher on average than inflation. It's only beating it about 6.5 out of every 10 years, almost 7. And on the flip side too, if you're too conservative and have almost no stocks and all bonds, and that would be Elliott's under the mattress portfolio, the cash that he was talking about last time, you're also a little bit lower than that, closer to 6 out of 10 times of beating inflation. And what we find is somewhere in the middle, we actually have the best chance of beating inflation without seeing these extremely high highs, the highest average, and the lowest of lows. But Elliott, I guess how do you communicate this to your clients? Because the hardest thing that I always have to get them over, especially the younger ones, is sometimes it's okay to not earn the most.
Yeah, it's a challenging conversation because no one likes it when they're like, hey, my savings account paid me 4% this year and my portfolio is down -10, as an
Yeah.
example. And I think it just goes back to what are we trying to achieve and which part of the portfolio is for which part of life.
Hmm.
So that cash that earned 4%, that hypothetical example, that's for this year or the next year. The stuff in the portfolio that went down, that's not for the next 5 years. That's for year 15 or 20.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so interesting too, and we're definitely going to hit this in the election episode, but I still have like horrifying memories. I'm going to stop sharing this chart here of, just some of those clients over the years who got out, right before or right after an election, and they never got back in. And that's something where, you know, if you ask yourself, like, should I get out of the market or when should I get out of the market? I would highly, highly recommend you asking yourself the flip side of that question, which is, when should you or when do you get back into the market? Like, what does that look like? Because, you know, getting out and never going back in, you could miss out on some of the best years of rebound growth. And we saw that in the pandemic, where it wasn't even a
Yeah.
rebound year. It was like a decline 3 weeks and a holy cow, what's happening? These are awesome return, like subsequent 4 weeks or 5 weeks. And it all happened so fast. And if you think about that, where, if you use that earlier example of the market going down 46% and you sell, and then just a year later it's rebounded and you haven't ridden that back up, you've actually just lost 50% or 46% of your purchasing power. And you've really chalked your portfolio um, in half, and now you still have to decide when it's time to get back in.
Yeah. Better yet, have an investment policy statement that outlines exactly how you're investing, why you're investing, and that way you can just reference that document anytime anything happens.
Yeah, and maybe we'll include a sample in the show notes. Elliot and I will gladly just share our investment policy statements, and you know, even if you don't want to work with an advisor, like coming up with something similar for yourself can be a really, really good example. I think we'll take the actual investment holdings out of our policy that because we don't want to,
I have a
you
sample I'm
know,
happy to share that I have on my
yeah,
website anyway. So we'll share that out
yeah,
so people can create them for themselves.
yeah, yeah. But anything else you'd want to, I guess, wrap things up with on this topic, Elliot?
Just to reiterate that I think it's important to educate yourself about market history because it's not a matter of if markets are going to go down, it's when they're going to go down. And so just being aware of what does my investment picture look like at that point, and are my funds invested in a way that aligns for when I plan to use them. So going back to that previous episode.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. Yeah. And I guess, the final thing I would add is allow yourself to feel, the roller coaster, but don't react to the feeling of the roller coaster. If you see your account and it's making you uncomfortable, I think Elliot had the right idea just before we wrap things up here. But you know, maybe it's time to revisit that investment policy statement if it's really, really, really unsettling to you. But also reacting and trying to get off the roller coaster when you've just went down the biggest hill is more likely than not going to set you back years or possibly even decades
Yeah.
of hard work that you've done. And that's something where you'd think over time it gets easier, but the truth is when you're 20 and have $5,000 in your Roth IRA and it goes down 50%, that's $2,500. That's still a lot of money, don't get me wrong, but when you're 50 or 60 and that account is now $500,000 and it goes down 50%, that's a $250,000 swing, and that it never gets easier. I feel like it's one of those things where it actually gets harder to not react the further on down the road you go. So yeah.
Definitely.
All right. Well, we'll be back in a couple of weeks to talk about election years with the stock market, since I know those questions will be coming. And yeah, it's always a fun conversation. But Good to see you, Elliot, and talk to you in a couple of weeks.
Looking forward to it.